Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the History Things podcast. I'm your host, Matt Borders, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Pat McGuire. Now, our guest this evening is someone who is well known in the Civil War community. In fact, unless you are completely new to this subject, under a rock, you likely would have run into our guest at some point. We have historian Garry Adelman with us tonight, and he is going to be involved with not only the American Battlefield Trust, but also with the Center for Civil War Photography. But tonight, he's going to be talking about one of his early topics. Now, the reason that we wanted to pull Garry on here is because last summer, we did a blitz for the 160th of Gettysburg, all over the field, different topics, but one of the things we didn't cover was Little Round Top.
Yeah, we stayed away from it.
We did, to be perfectly honest. It's a well-trod story, and of course, there's all that work being done up there on Little Round Top.
That was a big part of it.
That was a big part of it. So we brought Garry on to actually talk about that aspect of the fight and some of the mythology that is developed behind it. Garry, excellent. Great to see you, sir. I see you've got a copy of the book. Now, that's actually one of the reasons why I thought it would be great to have you on, because this is how I met you, sir.
Wow. Can you remind me of that? First of all, thanks for having me, guys. Looking forward to getting into whatever you want to get into. And wow, I thought we met in association with, the Valley and Cool Spring Battlefield. We met before that, huh?
We did, very briefly. I didn't expect you to remember this, but so Pat, we're going to go in the Wayback Machine here.
Oh my God.
Garry, your book on the myth of Little Round Top came out in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah.
So that summer, I was doing my first summer as a seasonal ranger.
You're dating yourself, man.
I'm very much dating myself. And so myself and Bob Woodworth, our friend of mine, another seasonal ranger, we were doing what seasonal rangers do. We were wandering around on our days off, and Bob found out about Garry giving a talk on just this topic up in Gettysburg. Went up. I found out that you were a fellow Spartan, so had to go say hi. Little go green there.
Michigan.
And then we said a quick hi. I was impressed to meet you. I loved the topic. Bought a copy of it for one of my great best friends back home. And yeah, that was the first time, folks, I ever met Garry Adelman.
Dude, I totally remember, man. I can't believe you would suspect I wouldn't.
I appreciate it regardless.
Getting strong like Lee and Grant and Appomattox. Like, yeah, I definitely remember you right now, bro. Vibes. Garry, thank you for joining us on the show. Welcome. It's very awesome to have you here.
Glad to be here, man.
So, all right. Well, look, let's not beat around the bush, right? Time is money, talk is cheap, and we are definitely on mission to tell a rad story today, and I want to get right into it. So when we focus on the American Civil War, Matt and I like to talk about all 4 years of it. We are aware there is a huge community that likes to focus on 3 days of those 4 years. And we are honored and privileged to actually live right in proximity to that. So we get to live in that world, meet so many of those people, and have so many of these conversations. And so many of them, it seems, Garry, revolve around the fighting on July 2nd on Little Round Top. And it all seems to come back to a real life person and a fake person. Looking at you, Buster. But it always seems to come back to the 20th Maine, to Chamberlain, and how basically without them, man, the entire Union Army, poof, gonna crumble. A lot of credence to that argument, but I know there's much more to it. And with the title of your book going right after it right there, I figure you're probably the very best person to tell this story. So if you were to tell our listeners about the myth of Little Round Top and just, what really happens up there, where would you begin that story? Do you jump right to the fighting, or do you have a setup to it?
Yeah, no, I mean, this book is getting kind of old, so I don't do it much anymore, and I'm happy to talk about it. And I've been looking for people to really argue with me about this for more than 2 decades. So I'm ready if there's anything you disagree with. Let me also disclaim that, I'm known as the Gettysburg guy, although, I do tours everywhere and do videos everywhere. But I'll say it a million times. The West is more important than the East. Vicksburg's more important than Gettysburg, and at least what happened, what the results were. I'm not saying Gettysburg's unimportant, different story. But I guess the way I would start talking about the myth is this idea that, these stories that people tell about the import of the Hill, the import of Joshua Chamberlain, the import of Buster Kilrain, even people didn't feel like that right after the battle. People didn't talk that way right after the battle. People didn't talk that way, right after the war. It took a while until people started equating Little Round Top with the loss of Gettysburg, Little Round Top with the loss of the Civil War. It took a good 40 years until it became regular to talk about the loss of Little Round Top being the same as we live in a much different place today because the South wins the Civil War. That took decades to happen. So I guess that's my intro to it. And if it took decades to happen, why? Why did it take that long? And what was the actual military situation at the time? So to answer your question in a long way, I actually like to set up what the myth was, then trace the growth of the myth, and then talk about the military actualities at the time.
Well, let's do it then. What is the myth? I actually just quick first question. If it took that long to come to this myth's creation, I guess when we're talking immediate aftermath, what is, if it's not Little Round Top that's in the national consciousness of like, this is what it all hinged upon, what is it? Is it the fighting at Herbst Woods? Is it Culp's Hill? Like, what is the linchpin of the whole thing if it's not Little Round Top?
I suspect it's the charge that folks are gravitating towards.
It's interesting. I mean, Pickett's Charge did get, big time attention right away. But it's the things that, why is Little Round Top the Mecca? It's the Mecca because it emerged as the largest or bloodiest, however you want to call it that. It was the first place preserved. It was near the population centers. It was photographed. Then you had the Gettysburg Address. It was like boom, 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 these things coming out. But some of the most popular stories earlier were the death of General Reynolds and the loss, on the first day. And then when people would come to town, they could go and see the effects of the battle on Culp's Hill. I mean, Little Round Top was miles to the south, and Pickett's Charge just looked like a bunch of open fields. So early on, people did talk about Pickett's Charge, but I'll give it to really the first day and, Culp's Hill is getting the early attention. Ironically, Culp's Hill, you could walk there from town on easy roads, really gained a lot more attention than the likes of Little Round Top. But when it was first preserved, Pickett's Charge was not preserved. It was East Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Little Round Top were the first, lands to actually be preserved. So I also don't think there were competent guides for a while. So for a while, it was driven by who had the loudest mic. You call it Dan Sickles, talk about Samuel Wiley Crawford, and talk about the various states who have an interest in their troops, their Virginia troops, their North Carolina troops, their Wisconsin troops, telling those stories and having the battle revolve around what troops from those states did. So really, they just talked about the glorious victory. And as Little Round Top is concerned, the official records, most of the hundreds of official reports after Gettysburg don't even mention or reference Little Round Top. It didn't even have a name yet, but the Rocky Hill or the smaller of the two Round Tops, like it didn't even get mentioned much. And only 4 of the 35 that mentioned it attached any importance to Little Round Top in the first place. So that's getting into the weeks and months after the battle. It would take a little longer until the story started to grow.
Well, I was going to say, what is the myth proper then? So you said it starts by addressing the myth, let's just give our listeners the myth.
Yeah. The myth, I mean, is one that I used to tell, I confess. And that's something that's tough as a historian when you admit that you were wrong. It's not easy, but it's always better in the long run to do that once you know it. These, soldiers from civilian life on an isolated hill far from home, many under the command of a professor who barely knew how to fight yet. And upon their shoulders on the flank of the Union Army sat the future of the experiment in the democratic republicanism. Could this experiment take? No, because of these 400 men from Maine on the end of the line in a small Pennsylvania countryside. And if they wouldn't have held, we'd live in a different place today. That's the myth.
Yep. Well, I'm familiar with that myth because I have seen the movie Gettysburg.
Yes.
That movie is amazing. Does a lot for our community, especially if you were in my age bracket, Matt's age bracket, like we were young, and man, that movie spoke to us. But it definitely leans hard into those guys from Maine being the be all and end all of the entire thing. So where were you in your Civil War studies, were you like a younger, like I haven't even heard of the ORs yet type of interest in the hobby, and or were you in the profession at that point when you first started to come across this doesn't really jive with the record, there's other units here, the record doesn't talk about this? Like, where were you in life when that sort of crept into your consciousness that this was a narrative?
Yeah, well, you're the first one ever asked me that. I'm a little bit embarrassed because I was further along than I'd like. I had managed to pass the very difficult battlefield guide test, still telling portions of that myth. Every tour I gave in my first few years, I talked about how all of the regiments on Little Round Top were important. Had any of them broken, we might live in a different place today. Right. So for my first several years of guiding, that would be from 95 until 2001, I was telling some element of the myth. I never bought into the whole Chamberlain thing. I knew that he was just one of many colonels, and I would explain, by the way, how who's next to Chamberlain? Orpheus Woodward, dead within a year. Who's next to him? James C. Rice, dead within a year. Who's next to him? Norvell Welch, dead within a year. So I would explain that the guy who lived and could write really well would tell the story of Little Round Top. Right. But I did also equate, and I even did that in my first Little Round Top book. These are very hard to get, by the way, for anybody watching. Secondary market, go for it. Don't pay 80 or $100. You can still get most of it on this podcast. Actually, you'll get most of the story for at least the myth of Little Round Top. Now that they're redoing Little Round Top, I'll need to go a little further. So it was when I went back, I went to get my master's in Shippensburg after taking the better part of a decade off after my undergrad. And I went to Shippensburg, and as my main thesis, I started writing this counterfactual history of Little Round Top. And it was as soon as I started looking into it that I realized that looking at two things: A, that the myth took time to grow, and B, that when you actually looked at the military situation, that what most of us said was absolutely psycho, that these superhuman Confederates who never captured Little Round Top were going to, take the hill, capture the Taneytown Road, turn the guns on their enemy, repel the 9,000 reinforcements that were coming that way, and scare away the largest army in the world. It was just crazy talk. So I changed it from the counterfactual history to trying to speculate as little as possible and debunk the myth. So this would have been around 2001 when I really had the epiphany.
But it's good to like have those epiphanies, like no matter where you are in your journey with, whatever you're studying, like, or, like whether it's music, you're playing something, you do something right, whatever. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Like once you kind of figure something out the right way or whatever, like just to, be humble enough to go with it. I do this. We're doing this at my site right now. Our Civil War story is getting a bit of a tweak because we're getting better access to some of the records of some of the units. And we're realizing that some of the small skirmishes relative to where I work are a little bit bigger. And we've been kind of underselling the story a little bit. And it's like, well, maybe we should lean into it, but that's a story for another day. So what do you do then at that point? You just go right to writing your book, or does it start with, developing a new interpretation over many years, many tours? Does it evolve just from like listening to other people interpret it? Like, how do you, sort of move away from an understood and a held narrative?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say that I think you really summarized exactly what my job is, and to an extent, y'all's job, as Rangers, podcasters. When I try to summarize what my job really is, it's for what you just described, so that somebody somewhere during the tour, during the presentation, during reading what I wrote, watching a video says, that's what it was like. And those epiphanies, people have them, on battlefields, they have them at home, they have them while watching videos. When they get this little flash into the past, I don't know of anything more worthy that we do as history people than to try to foster that epiphany. And they could be minor ones or they could be major discoveries, but it happens to me, luckily, because this is my full-time job, like y'all. I mean, we're actually paid to do a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just come across things all the time. Right now I'm reading about Salmon Chase and Fitzjohn Porter at the same time that I'm trying to study up for all the year's tours up here. And several times a week I get those little moments. Some are bigger than others, but those little epiphanies. Now, to answer your question, I think what really affected me was not just going to the official records and rereading all the Gettysburg ORs to see who was mentioning Little Round Top and then scouring newspapers, but it was actually much later when I started getting into the Glenn Tucker, Bruce Catton, Harry Fonts, Tom Desjardins era, so to speak, and the Michael Shera, Ken Burns, series. That's when I started to really see like, okay, who's bought into this? Okay. Right. And I saw that Tucker and Fonts and Coddington, really didn't buy much into this, whereas you have people like Bruce Catton, who was like, yes, maybe a nation was saved or something like that. So that was really when it started to hit me that there was no historian consensus on this, that, it seemed to depend on what story you wanted to tell rather than that nobody had. And that was another epiphany, realizing that nobody had ever really examined the viability of putting artillery up there, damaging the Union Army, who was already ordered to the left, and when were those orders sent? Did Meade have to scramble reinforcements, or was it before? And how far is the Tawnytown Road from the summit of Little Round Top? And how many Confederate reinforcements could there have been? What was their ammunition? What was the daylight? Once I realized nobody did this, I just jumped right in. And then, I didn't go at it like a lawyer. There's a lot of lawyer historians out there who have the conclusion and try to prove it. Right. I really did not want to tear down my favorite place in the entire world where unconfirmed reports suggest my ashes will be scattered one day. Yes. I love this place. I still drive through the Valley of Death. I've lived in Gettysburg for 10 years. I've been a guide there for, 28 or something. I still drive through the Valley of Death and gaze to my left and just say, like, in my mind, it's like, wow, that's awesome. Respect. Yeah. Like on the Emmitsburg Road, I gaze toward the Round Tops. I'm just in awe of the place. So I was not anxious to tear it down. Rather, everything I learned pointed me toward the same conclusion, that the Confederates, if they captured Little Round Top, couldn't have done much with it from everything we know.
That's so dramatic when you think about what people even today still consider to be its importance, and how people speak to the reverence of Chamberlain and his fighting men and Saint Bustro Kilrain. Like we're at the time of recording this, the Remembrance Day parade has just come and gone recently, and I'm gonna just speculate, but I think north of 60% of the people up there would tell you, that's crazy, Gary. This is the most strategically important part of the battlefield. The Confederates would have changed everything. The nation was saved right there, Gary.
Do you know why? Because it was a classic textbook maneuver. I mean, I have people quoting Ken Burns to me all the time. No, it was a classic textbook maneuver. Oh, okay, I guess you win then. Yeah, you just said it was a classic textbook maneuver. I couldn't agree with you more. Although, I don't see people as obsessed with the myth as they once, were. And I don't say that because of
I would agree with
book.
that.
I say it because when Ken Burns and Gettysburg were fresh, there wasn't a whole lot of other things out there. Now there are hundreds of videos. I mean, the Trust alone has 300 or 400 videos on Gettysburg.
Wow.
Right. And like it or not, it's the ones that people watch the most. Like it's just, when the Trust is trying to save land at Gettysburg versus at anywhere else. When we ask our members, what's your favorite battlefield? It's, Gettysburg just blows it all away. So I'm not sure if it's fair that Gettysburg's the Mecca, but it is. And there's so much available now that I think we have a slightly more learned public, even if, I'd be happy if it only is, if it's 60 or 70% at the Remembrance Day Parade that think that, that buy into the myth. It probably used to be 90.
I'm a cynical person, so that number is higher probably for me than most people. But and I speak to sort of a character that's created on this show where I am the grumpy Antietam guy, because Matt and I, we always like to lean into this bit where we, based on our professional studies, think Antietam campaign a little bit more important in the scope of American history. But we were told by another guest we had on the show this summer, while that may or may not be true, you'll never change the narrative away from Pickett's charge.
That's true.
And the Battle of Gettysburg itself. And I respect that because it is true. So it does speak to, small victories. If it is only 60 or 70, hey, it being 90, Gary, we're doing good work. Hopefully we're doing good work.
Right.
Hopefully everybody else is doing good work.
Yeah. I just don't know how people, historians, try to say that Gettysburg is the turning point, or as important a turning point as the twin Antietam and Kentucky rebuff,
Mhm.
or the turning point of Gettysburg and Vicksburg combined,
Right.
or the turning point at Fort Sumter, which is rather important. I really, I mean, we kind of lose our minds when we start to get toward our obsessions.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot to tear down, in my case, my favorite place in the world. Like, I really like Little Round Top, if that's not evident.
Well, that's why I'm fascinated by the fact that you wrote this book so early in your career too, because it's kind of a bold thing to do when you're getting started. You would think that playing it safe and like maybe not so much publicly attacking or writing a book, but just kind of like going with the flow of things, young guy, young historian, but to write a book like that coves and challenges a narrative like that and as fully as you do, like it's pretty ballsy, it's pretty awesome. Respect.
Hey, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
So, but it's cool though that seeing you now still so excited about what you do, and not just seeing it in the millions of places we can see you be excited, Garry, but like here on the show right now, like I can feel that you're excited. You probably had a long day, and I can still that you're still very excited to talk about the Civil War, Gettysburg, the record and things like that. And that's pretty inspiring, all things considered, because there's a lot of people that struggle with jade, myself personally, pretty jaded individual regularly. So I learned about you. I never heard of you until Tony and Ridley Scott did a documentary. And then I was like, who is this? Who is this mofo all over the screen? But you're a captivating storyteller. And then I met you at Antietam during one of the, I think it was like the 152nd day hike there. And that was cool experience. And it's kind of neat to see people over the span of many years, because that was like almost 10 years ago now at this point as well, but
crazy.
Still excited, right? And to see that this book is, written so long ago, not that any of us are old men. We're all very young men, all of us, especially me. But no, thanks. It's really cool to see that. So what was the response when you did this at the time, when you wrote this book? Gettysburg is such a, it's such a revered subject. Don't mess with the status quo. Like, was there backlash? Was this book received with open arms? Was it viewed with like, what have you done, Garry?
Especially with the senior guides up there, you being only a few years into the guides, did you have any of the gang up there challenging or not sure about this?
Yeah, so for what it's worth, the Devil's Den book, Devil's Den: A History and Guide, did come out 6 years before that.
It did,
so
yes,
I was kind of getting a little bit of, I was getting a little cred there at that point. And Tim and I had started to give Little Round Top talks and presentations specific to roundtables, and we would give sometimes the big park battle walks out there. So we kind of started angling ourselves as, Round Top South End kind of guys, like when it came to that part of the battlefield and whatnot. So we had a little bit of cred. Nonetheless, I really expected a lot of pushback. I expected a lot of arguments ahead, but I didn't expect to lose them, and I'm a pretty conciliatory guy, but about this, like, I became pretty certain, and I have some pretty tough statements in the book, such as that historians have never placed so much faith in troops who failed to win as they place in the Confederates who never even captured Little Round Top. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So I went out there and I was kind of evocative with it. And then, as I think I already mentioned, like, nobody would really argue with me about it. So, I mean, it's very gratifying that it was well accepted. And let's put it into perspective. I mean, it sold 5,000 copies, 3,000 copies, and then reprinted 2,000 more. So it was good at the time. It sold pretty quick, but it's been out of print for 15 years or more now, and they're pretty hard to get. I have one left beside the ones I keep up in my office, like my field copies. I only have one left.
You better protect it, Garry. Somebody's going to come challenge you for it. Trial by combat. You better watch out.
I'm scrappy, man.
I've seen your hands, man. Your hands are fast. You don't want to mess with Garry Adelman.
I'm not sure how much power there is behind the punch, but they're quick.
Well, sometimes it is the volume. Just you keep tapping.
All right. Well, speaking of the fighting, right? Nobody wants to fight Garry or myself. People might want to fight me. I don't know. People have been listening to this show for a while. Get pretty heated over some of the things I say from time to time. But you know what? Whatever. But let's get into some of the fighting, right? If it's not just if it's not all just relying upon Maine, what are some of the other important moments of the fighting that maybe don't fall on the shoulders of boys from Maine, that were hunting Dia the summer before in Maine?
Oh,
sorry, that was a different movie that featured those guys. Different movie.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, what was I going to say actually about fighting? Yeah, let me just say that, because, y'all are podcasters, you make videos, and you're Rangers. One thing I can tell you, and I have a decent sized fan following, I'm really happy, but nobody is everybody's cup of tea. So I do have people that want to argue with me and fight with me about other subjects. It's basically because of who I am, or, I'm pretty apolitical when it comes to my public face. I really don't try to, antagonize too many people, except historians who have cheated or not played fair or something like that. Because that's what historians are supposed to do with each other.
You need to put the belt on the line and just throw down with them. Just lean into it, turn heel, and be like, "You want to go? I'm Garry and Adelman," and just hard F-bomb and then go at them.
Dude, I am from Chicago, so that gives me some credit as well.
All right, Cubs, real quick, important question: Cubs or White Sox?
Of course, Cubs. I'm from Evanston.
All right, good.
So, let me say, when it comes to the fighting, I'm glad you asked, because, it's almost like this focus on the 15th Alabama against the 20th Maine on the far extreme end. It makes a good story, don't get me wrong.
Sure.
But it's like, never mind the 10 other Union regiments fighting on Little Round Top. Never mind the multiple other Confederate regiments who are up there. Never mind the 9,000 soldiers who are coming. But the way that this works is that the Confederates, of course, have two different brigades mixed up. They commingle on the way up, so that you've got elements of Laws and Robertson's brigades of Alabamians and Texans attacking Little Round Top, maybe a little help from some other Alabamians coming from Devil's Den, but these are really separate fights. I have no documented instance of Confederate soldiers from Devil's Den then fighting on Little Round Top, other than providing maybe some supporting fire from one Alabama regiment. In any case, you got them approaching this over by far the most difficult terrain Gettysburg has to offer, after the longest Confederate march to get to Gettysburg on the second hottest day of the summer, blah, 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 blah. You know all this.
Right.
And of course, the Union struggles to get into position without the impressive stone walls you see there today. And you see these troops from Maine, and then, of course, next to them, 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, 16th Michigan. Okay. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be an intense fight rolling from the Union right to the Union left. Did I miss somebody yet?
No. Matt's from Michigan, and anytime we say Michigan on this show, it's like your tax you got to pay. You got to acknowledge that he's from the mitten.
Now, much love for the 16th Michigan. It's not their best day, but they do their job up there.
Well, I'm glad I mentioned Norvell Welsh, and I'll say that, once in a while I go out to Fort Welsh, out at the Petersburg Breakthrough. And it's an impressive fort where the Park Service has done a great job on the west side of Petersburg. So it's a pretty intense fight. You all know the story. It goes back and forth like a great wave until a third of the men from Maine are down, a third of the men from Alabama are down. Everybody knows that story. Fewer people know that it was equally dangerous, if not more so, when the 4th Texas is on the plateau right below the crest. And, sorry, Matt, the men from Michigan, part of them begin to retire with their flag because of a mistaken order. You've got Strong Vincent, the brigade commander, not punching, but waving
him back into
crop. Riding crop up there to try to rally them. That's probably when he's mortally wounded up there. And right as the Michiganders are falling back, here come the 538 men from Rochester, New York, under Patty O'Rourke, frothing at the mouth, according to one of the documentaries that I was on. I think it was Civil War Combat or something. And they pitch into the Texans. Now, had O'Rourke not arrived right at that moment, had he not been detached essentially by General G.K. Warren to come up there, that was every bit as dangerous, if not more, than what was going on the far Union left with the Maine and Alabama troops, because these guys were about to be up on the crest, not on Vincent's Spur or something like that. So that could have been a disastrous moment. And I sort of treat that moment and the moment of the 20th Maine versus, when they may have outflanked the Alabamians, and they probably didn't happen at the same time. It looks like, I imagine, the 140th New York came up maybe 20 minutes before things really climaxed on the other end of the line on Little Round Top. But to me, I sort of call all that the critical point. Whichever ones would have succeeded, what was the situation right then? Okay. Could the Confederates have captured the cannons up there? Could they have reached the Tawnytown Road? What reinforcements might have been able to come up? So there's this story within a story. There's the one we know, and then there's what's going on in close proximity. When you start looking, you find that General Meade had already ordered before then, before 4 o'clock, the 5th Corps, 7 of the 8 brigades of the 6th Corps, Caldwell's 2nd Corps Division, like over to the Union left. Those orders were already written, so nothing else had to be done to retake or defend Little Round Top. At that point, you start to realize that the Confederates, in the actual fighting, lost 6 of their 10 regimental commanders, 2 of their 3 brigade commanders weren't in command of the unit they were in before. They lost their division commander and John Bell Hood. There's no ammunition train, zero evidence of an ammunition train coming up for the Confederates. So assuming that most cannons that were left to the Confederates at Gettysburg, even temporarily, that usually the Union retreated with their firing implements. I don't know how the Confederates are going to use those up there. How is it that the next day when the Union, and I know I'm going off your question a little bit, but the next day on July 3rd, the Union had a great opportunity to fire those cannons, Haslets, now under a guy named Rittenhouse, to the north. You know, this is exactly the direction in which they might be firing, if not more generously, toward Pickett's charge. And as Pickett's charge started, 4 of those guns of Hazlitt were able to rake the Confederates. Then, because Little Round Top's a thin apex, they found that they were getting lined up one behind the other. So then there was only 2. And by the time the Confederates got anywhere near Cemetery Ridge, they can only fire 1. But we assume the Confederates could capture all 6 cannons and blast into the woods where the Union reinforcements would be coming from, and that they'd have all the ammunition and firing implements that they would need, and that the Union wouldn't be able to get cover of the hill just like the Confederates did when they attacked. So it's a real double standard that people apply to only studying or coming to understand via video or movie one little part of the fight to the exclusion of what's going on around it.
I found that studying Gettysburg is a good microcosm of how people understand the Civil War. Like if you take like a general public poll of it, everybody is still sort of experiencing the romanticism of the Centennial era and I would say like the turn of the century. Like there's a few different post-Civil War eras that really lean into the sort of the strong and romantic, Confederate army and this
near invincibility of said army
force and these ragtag. It's weird, like ragtag holding it together with a shoestring defense Union, soldiers. And it's really weird when you look at it the way the record says, right? There's this well-placed Union line with 9,000 reinforcements coming up for it. There is this, Confederate army that is exhausted. Like these guys are wrecked before they even fight. They're not getting an ammunition train, things like that. It's funny how much the, other myths of the Civil War carry through into little stories, like, isolated to just Little Round Top or, just Herbst Woods or just the Sunken Road at Antietam and things like that. But it's neat because you can, once you sort of understand the themes of history, you can kind of start to separate, the good stuff from the bad stuff. And you realize this sounds familiar, which means it's probably a theme. So
Gary, I'm really glad that you mentioned the guns up there, because you're right. There is this mythology that, we'll turn the guns on them and that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is, where are they going to get the ammunition? And like you said, those cannoneers aren't dumb. If they've got to abandon the pieces, they're going to take their implements with them. So yeah, that's a point that I think a lot of folks miss. They would have done everything they could to get the ammunition out of the area, and they definitely would have gotten the implements. So there wouldn't have been any ability to even fire those pieces had they captured them. And like I said, I don't think that's something that most folks think about.
Yeah, that's cool. Go ahead. Keep going, guys.
No, you're good.
When it comes to the myth itself and its development, would you say that a lot of that hinges, because I've commented on this before to other folks, it really seems to hinge on the post-war writings and later writings of Chamberlain himself. His initial, if I remember correctly, and by all means, please do correct, if I remember correctly, his initial reports on the battle are very much matter of fact. They're not too grandiose or even pumping up the 20th more than any other regiment up there. But it's as he is moving into his post-war life, as he's being able to reflect and write more, that's when we start seeing this ever-expanding story about the importance of, and again, not to knock the 20th Maine and their work, but expanding on what they did.
I like that, when you said knock, you sound a little bit more Midwest. So both of us retained some of those words that just still kind of come out. So
I'm told I draw out my E's, but I don't hear it personally.
You are from the mitten in many ways, Matt.
I've lived out east now for more than half my life. So when I go home, I'm shocked by my Chicago relatives. And most of my family's still there.
Chicago,
it's just crazy.
Your family roots for the Bears, it sounds like, Gary. It sounds like they root for the Bears.
Yeah, they do, and so do I. With one exception of a bright spot, it was a tough childhood in Chicago. I mean, we eventually had the Bulls, but I mean, I was already older. Yeah. By the time it was the '90s, so I had one good Bear season and then a bunch of good Bull seasons in the '90s. But I mean, I had one bright spot. I must count the Blackhawks.
Well, look, historically, maybe one day, because what we like to do before we sort of move into the wind down of the themes of things here and stuff is we like to offer people the opportunity to talk about other pieces of history they're passionate about but they might not get to do because say they don't work in that field. So if you ever want to talk about the historic World Series win of the Chicago Cubs, we can have you back to do that, because there's obviously a cool baseball story, but it is a history lesson. Obviously, it took a very long time to get it.
Yeah,
Pat loves talking sports history. Yeah. Well, in case we ever do this, I'll tease it with this, and then Matt, I will get back to your question or your comment. My grandfather was born in 1908, and when my mom was little in the 1940s, he told her, he said, "You'll love the Cubs, but they'll always break your heart." So for his whole life, they didn't get a World Series, and then my mom died in December of 2015, and so his whole life, and then her whole life, they didn't win a World Series. It was pretty special that they did finally get it the following year. But my God, literally lifetimes waiting for the Cubs to actually win.
Yeah, I mean, you could be born and live a very full life and die and not have seen that. So you lived through a special year, Gary. That's awesome, though. That yes. That you got to enjoy that for your family. And when we do that, definitely have you back for that. But getting back into Matt's question here, sorry, because I am the great derailer. That is my historic title. I am Pat the Derailer.
Isn't it called Derailing Things with Pat?
Yes,
I think that's what I heard it was.
My slowly becoming defunct blog, because I put all my effort here, should be called Derailing Things with Pat.
Maybe that's the resurrection.
Yeah, maybe that's how it comes back. Just me just stone colding things, just wrecking it.
If I may, maybe if you weren't derailing so much, you wouldn't have like 3.5 hour episodes, man. Who are these people? I mean, I wish I was younger when I used to like drive 3 hours to give a free talk to 4 people and stuff. And those days are so long gone. I've forgotten that there was a time where I could actually talk about history for 3 or 4 hours.
Oh yeah.
Right.
At a time.
Oh yeah.
I'm almost out of time now.
Yeah, no, I know. That's why I said we know that time is money and all that stuff, but we definitely have people that like to tell some stories. And whenever you feel the need to just, put out a 5-hour banger, give us a call, Gary. We'll put the mics on for 5 hours for you. But anyway, get back into it, man. Sorry.
It's all right.
Okay, so now let me just finish. So Matt brought up that Joshua Chamberlain had an outsized impact, and I think that's a mixed blessing. First of all, I would call his experience common, meaning we all tend to tell fish stories, and those fish stories get better as we get older, and you have more on the line. And everything like that. So I would say demonstrably he changed his stories over the years. That doesn't make him evil, and it doesn't make him different than a lot of the other people. And you would think, well, he has an outsized megaphone, so it must be mostly him. I mean, as a governor, as a great writer, as somebody involved with the Battlefield Commission, you would have thought that. But this is very widespread. I'm having trouble remembering, so I'm going to look. But 37 official records accounts mention a reference little round top, about equally split between the two hills, and a handful mention the importance, but none talk about it equating it with the loss at Gettysburg. The early newspapers, 3 out of 10, the 10 that I sampled, talk about the import, but not of the 20th Maine, but of rather the Pennsylvania Reserve. Samuel Wiley Crawford is very, able at making it seem like he's going to repulse everybody. He gets 6 medals of honor awarded, or they do, for 6 members of the 6th Pennsylvania Reserves over there. But when you get into the post-war, just from 1865 to 1873, 7 of the 8 things that I sampled talk about this being the key to the left. 4 of the 8 call it the key to the whole position. 4 of the 8 say the Union would have to retreat if they lost Little Round Top. And then Sykes and Meade start to, sort of dust it up about who was doing what. It's interesting because, Meade is under criticism during and after the war for, was he going to fall back? And then here's Sickles saying, look, Meade wasn't even going to occupy any of this stuff. He was going to leave Gettysburg. I saved the day. And then Meade says, no, I saved the day. I sent the 5th Corps to make up for you on Little Round Top. So people had their reasons for doing it too. But here's the deal. By 1880 to 1910, of the 20 sources I could find, 19 call it important. 7 talked about Union defeat. And people started to talk about equating that with the loss of the Civil War. And from 1911 to 1970, all the sources call it important. Half of them talk about Union retreat, and a third of them talk about losing the Civil War if they lost Little Round Top. So Chamberlain is hardly alone, in getting into this. Now, how much of an effect did he have upon these sources? That's a little tougher. But we have time and again people coming back to this, and the myth growing on every front. Newspapers, regimental histories, redone official records and reports by the time they were done in the 1880s and things like that. So, and then by the time John Pullen writes about the 20th Maine, and then Michael Shera writes about 8 people and only 1 colonel, and then Ken Burns picks up on that, and Ron Maxwell picks up on those. Man, it's just done. So as a guide, it was something I had to deal with a lot. Let me disclaim though, that, I'm a huge movie fan. And even when I know about something, if the story moves me, Titanic, Dances with Wolves, Napoleon, Gettysburg Glory, that's what's important. And I think as an interpreter, you guys know this, it's so much easier to undo the historical mess made by a movie or a documentary than to create the spark in the first place. So if people want to come to Gettysburg because of Joshua Chamberlain, fine, excellent, they're coming. So I think that's great. But by the time we really got on to all those movies, this modern media that has really elevated Chamberlain to godlike status, it was so well ingrained. One more thing. This is, any historian you guys know, knows the cyclical nature of this stuff. Mm-hmm. You can trace it through time, and Culp's Hill used to be popular, and now it's Little Round Top, and now it's closed, and Culp's Hill looks great, so maybe it's getting back some of its former glory. That's the nature of things, and I can't get enough of reflecting on something you guys started to mention, the superhuman Confederates. Just 8 years ago, 5 years ago, I used to have to talk people out of the thought on tours that Robert E. Lee wasn't perfect. Now I have to talk people into the idea that he wasn't this terrible, hateful general who must have been terrible because of how he felt. It's just what a world we're in general, throughout my whole guide experience, how popularity and public opinion really change how we view our historical figures. We shouldn't be that way, but as a general populace, we simply are. I have never guessed that I'd have had to say that Robert E. Lee's the guy you don't want to face. Everybody used to know that. Well, and now people reject it.
Gary, it speaks to the human element of all this, whether it's us, the storyteller, or the people that lived the moments of the stories we tell. We're all people, right? We have good days, bad days. Our energy is up, our energy's low. We're cynical, we're not cynical. We're all of these things. So on a personal level, I do this with McClellan on a monthly basis. Sometimes I'm like the worst commander I've ever seen in my life, and other times I'm like, we give this guy way too much crap. We give this guy, and it's weird, but individually I go through it.
Yeah. You said something that confused me. Did you say on some days energy is low? I'm not sure if I understand that.
Yes. You wouldn't, Gary, I do have 2 young children. And as much as when the camera is on, look, I'm a showman and I know you appreciate this. When the camera's on, you got to deliver the goods. But when the camera goes off, sometimes I just sit and I cry. Yeah. There's the hat. Right. So when the hat goes on, you're like, all right, it's business time. People are expecting me to be energetic, but sometimes you're like, I haven't had my coffee. And I don't know, maybe you're not, but sometimes the camera turns off here and I cry and Matt sits here silently, awkwardly for like 10 minutes and is like, "Are you all right, buddy?" And I say, no, but it's
not usually.
It's not known amongst most people, Gary, but I do have low energy moments. You got another hat? How many hats do you have?
It's sort of like my rank, my rebel hat, my Yankee hat. I got my revolution hat up there.
Yep. See the revolution.
I think, going bald, it really makes you suddenly have interest in hats that you didn't have before.
That's why I wear this sick beanie to cover up this satellite dish I have on my head that reflects images for NASA. You think James Webb is up there alone? No, NASA starts on my dome here and sends messages to the Webb satellite.
Well, we can use our hats to cry into them after difficult podcast episodes.
Well, I hope it's not too difficult of an episode, Garry.
Gary, before we get out of here, I do got to ask you one question, not a serious question, but as a lifelong metalhead, I heard recently a rumor that your partner in crime and colleague, Tim Smith, is also a metalhead. Can you confirm or deny this?
I can gladly confirm it and add to it as well. So Tim is not only a metalhead, but Tim is a heavy metal guitarist. Yes, tapes do exist of Tim and I performing. And let me tell you, I can do a lot of things. I'm good at a lot of things. I can cook, I can clean, I can juggle, I can do some of those things at the same time, but I cannot sing. But heavy metal makes it easier. It's like to disguise that I have a terrible singing voice. So Tim and I have performed his original song, Lee the Butcher, and that would be in 1994. And I do have said recording.
Gary, not in this moment, but is that recording ever going to see the light of day as somebody who loves vintage tapes?
I wonder, if that would be really up to Tim and I. I'm not opposed, but it's pretty bad. But Tim actually sang that one. I remember one of the lines. What is it? Let's see. Charging double canister, their ranks are ripped and torn, trampling fellow comrades, there is no time to mourn.
Man, I'm ready to go. I'm gonna punch Matt in the face.
I like that.
I'm ready to go, Gary.
So we did a couple other songs. Plus, I have a little bit more heavy metal cred, or at least metal cred, maybe not heavy, in that I'm personal friends now with Tommy Skio, formerly of Tesla, of Bad Marriage.
Yeah,
and
nice.
And I'm not sure how heavy Tesla was, but man, this dude in himself is heavy metal for sure. I mean, the dude still dresses like a hard rock.
I don't know how I describe Tesla. They're not a hair band, but they're from that era where they have a lot of that sound, but they're not like Motley Crue. We'll just say that they have more street cred than Motley Crue. I'll give them that. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, somebody told me recently that Tim Smith's a big Slayer fan, and I was like, what the literally that was my reaction to that, because I was
dude,
like, I would expect
he totally is. I mean, he's big into he was into Megadeth and Slayer. I don't think he was really into Minor Threat, but I'm
learning that you were into it, Gary. You were into metal too?
Dude, I'm an 80s kid. I went to middle school and high school in the 80s. I mean, to some extent.
We're starting a band. We're starting a band.
You think Gary's got enough time to start a band with everything he does?
Trust me. You don't know this, Gary, but band practice is next week, 7:00 my house.
Okay, let me set it up. Let me just say too, if you're a Stranger Things fan, all of a sudden you rediscover Metallica and Master of Puppets again.
Hell yeah.
Just jam to that, man.
Yeah.
Hell yes.
All right. So absolutely. Gary will also be back for our listeners out there, not just to talk about the Cubs, but when we do the history of heavy metal. Obviously, you'll have to bring Tim Smith for that one. I didn't realize that so many people were metalheads surrounding me. So that's pretty cool, Gary. You were a cool guy, and now you're a metalhead. So you're a cooler guy. That's pretty awesome.
Dude, I thought I was cool being a Pink Floyd, Pixies sort of Rolling Stone guy, but I'll be metalhead, man.
No, man. See, in my world, if you're not out there shouting at the devil, Metallica, I'm just kidding. I love all music, but I definitely cut my teeth as a metalhead personally before I jumped into the world of history professionally. But Gary, we'll have you back to shoot the some other time. I enjoyed this look at Little Round Top. It was refreshing, considering mostly what we hear is it's St. Joshua Chamberlain and St. Buster Kilrain, and my God, the Union was preserved because of them. It's good to see that even long before guys like Matt and I sat behind microphones, and guys like our mutual friend Matt Callery sat behind his microphone and talked about, Gettysburg in a more honest and open way, that you were way ahead of that with a number of other people, writing books and doing the speaking circuit, talking more openly, more honestly, using the record and not so much the narrative as has been passed down by popular history. So I've enjoyed you sharing that with us and with our listeners. So thank you, mate. Thank you very much for coming on our show tonight.
Guys, thanks for having a rocking podcast and for doing what you do, for what it's worth. I was shouting into the dark into, where I would give talks, like I said, where there was 3 or 4 people. I just can't believe this world where people actually want to hear from me. It's very gratifying. I appreciate you having me. And I appreciate, anybody watching who is interested in learning more about preserving battlefields. Sign up for our emails at battlefields.org. If you're a civil war photography nerd, go to civilwarphotography.org as well. And you don't have to give any money. Just sign up for our emails or watch our videos and everything like that. And it's very gratifying to me. Guys, keep at it. There's a lot of other people competing for the ears and the eyeballs. But I think there's room enough for all of you. I enjoy all the podcasts you guys were just mentioning.
Absolutely. Everybody's got a different teacher that they need. So happy to be a voice in the community as well. So thank you very much, Garry, for joining us. For my co-host today, Matt Borders, I'm Pat McGuire. This has been Garry Adelman. This is the History Things Podcast. We'll catch you all later.
Have a good night.